Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Entrepreneurial Space podcast. Today, we are excited to introduce Tim Parsons, new space investor, advisor, and mentor. After obtaining a PhD in Aeronautical Engineering from Imperial College London, he began a long and storied career in leadership roles at internet tech companies. Around 2014, he came back into the space fold and eventually was influential in establishing the new Australian Space Agency. Now he plays an active role in incubating and advising new space companies. Tim's rare combination of aeronautical engineering doctoral education with extensive internet and deep tech professional experience uniquely enables him to evaluate and mentor new space companies. Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me, Jeremiah and Balaji.
Great to have you here, Tim. Nice to meet you. Looking forward for the interview.
So Tim, please tell us briefly about your background and how you became involved in the new space industry.
Sure. I mean, after that introduction, it's a lot of pressure to live up to, so I'll do my best. Like a lot of people as a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was very lucky to meet Charlie Duke, who was both Capcom and also a commander of one of the Apollo missions as a teenager. And that set me on this kind of journey. Okay, I really wanted to be involved in space. Like a lot of people, wanted to experience it firsthand, and ended up having an academic career. And then right at the end of that academic career, where, the next step, not logical step, would have been to join NASA, space had kind of gone a little bit cold and the internet was really, really hot. So I ended up having a career in the internet industry. And then full circle, that all the things that made the internet so dynamic started to affect deep tech more generally, and specifically, space. The mobile phone revolution started making satellites much more powerful, much smaller, much lighter, and entrepreneurs came in and started to disrupt the price point of launch, of comms, of every aspect. Right at the time that we started to have the infrastructure to be able to use the massive volumes of data you get from space about the Earth. And of course, space being the ultimate high ground, the ultimate vantage point to look at the planet, just as we started to reshape society into a mobile phone, internet connected, always on, just in time, economy and society and so forth. So space, from being kind of like I'm leaving the Earth and I'm going to the moon and I'm going out to the universe and I'm exploring. It also flips around and it actually helps you rediscover the Earth. Also, we have huge problems to deal with, right? We're as a species, we're pushing at planetary boundaries in water, in energy, in soil. We're using all sorts of things that are, finite. And so space is helping us to manage those, helping us to understand those, and saving lives every day, making things better every day. And now space is also becoming this commercial realm. The governments shouldered a lot of the early risk, as they often do in new areas. And now the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well. And so a lot of money, a lot of talent, a lot of new kind of thinking, not just technological thinking, but also business, legal, artistic, creative, educational thinking is coming into this sector and really, rejuvenating this, essentially this sort of operating system for the planet. So I think it's a very exciting time. I feel very blessed. Even though, at one stage I was feeling very squashed because I'd missed out on, the manned space experiences of Apollo and Skylab and then the International Space Station. I was always just that little bit too young or a little bit too old. But now I feel pretty blessed that space is now imbricated so deeply into everyday life, and it's going to, I believe, solve a lot of the world's problems, and also create a lot of incredible experiences for everybody. How did I do?
Great. Yeah, that's an excellent introduction. Thank you. So the Asia Pacific region, so you're based in Australia now, right?
Correct.
The Asia Pacific region is really establishing itself as a force in the new space arena. To name a few examples, Japanese new space has received hundreds of millions in funding, up to around $1 billion, with companies like Astroscale, iSpace, and Axel Space. There's Rocket Labs in New Zealand, of course. Australia has just established a space agency focused on incubating startups, with well-funded companies like Gilmore Space. After the US, China and Singapore and India have the second, third, and fifth largest private equity investment in the world. So what can you tell us about the status of new space in the Asia Pacific region and what differentiates it from the rest of the globe?
So I think, the typically in ASEAN, and I'd include Australia in this, the government hasn't been a big customer for local companies. Typically, governments locally have bought internationally. They bought big communication satellites from European and American companies. They've been consumers of data. They've been consumers of, global GPS services, which are, open source predominantly. So they essentially haven't really been a customer of local businesses. And so local businesses really had to either come up with downstream companies that were dealing with data, had to start selling directly to, farmers, to corporations, or if they were upstream companies, they had to try to break into these quite vertically integrated supply chains overseas. Now, what's changing is that governments, that have had more established space agencies like JAXA, for example, in this region, they're starting to unbundle. They're starting to say, okay, well, the role of a space agency isn't to be the ultimate system integrator. Actually, one of the key roles of the space agency is to be an enabler of industry. The other thing that's a little different too is if you take the Australian Space Agency, it was not founded as a research organization. It was founded specifically as a new type of space agency to drive two specific goals. One is to create 20,000 new jobs in space, high-tech, high-paying jobs in space by 2030, which ranges from, super scientists right through to space tradies, people who are working on, launch sites, they're working in assembly of equipment, they're right through to, exotic stuff like quantum computing, optical comms, space situational awareness, and so forth, right? So we've got a whole range of different skill sets. And then the other target we've had is to triple the value or triple the annual turnover of the Australian space sector. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is this Australia's kind of set this example of let's come up with some econometric targets to shoot for. And how does that change how they go about things? And so what's happened with the Australian Space Agency, they decided that the way to deliver to this strategic objective is actually to create roadmaps, right? Which is a classic thing you do, is to create these metrics to measure progress across 7 different strategic areas, which includes things like Earth observation, includes things like space situational awareness and traffic management. They include things like access to space and so forth. So these roadmaps are now informing a sort of smart investment strategy. And so I think that's something that I expect a number of the other players in ASEAN to sort of observe and watch. So instead of the traditional, big research organization type space agency, NASA, ESA, JAXA, even the Chinese and Russian space agencies were fundamentally research organizations. That function may well be split apart into communities that exist in universities or big kind of research labs. And I think the space agency locally will realize, we need to become enablers. And also, when it comes to things like disaster response, when it comes to critical infrastructure, dealing with the fact that if you do not have access to space services, a modern society grinds to a halt. So increasingly governments are becoming customers of those systems, and they're buying space systems, and they're saying, well, if we're going to spend $1 billion or $5 billion on a space system, let's make sure that we end up with some sovereign capability. Let's make sure that we end up with a domestic industry which can compete globally, right? And so that's, so I would say new space has led not just to, let's use a .com Silicon Valley approach to designing and developing systems and, leveraging the cheap, the Moore's law effect on computing. Let's also think about how we drive an ecosystem that creates lots of different spin-out benefits for broader society.
Fascinating. So you are the expert in residence at the New Space Accelerator National Space Industry Hub, and also a new space angel investor. At what stage would you consider investing in a startup? What I mean by that is the early ideation phase or prototype, MVP, post-revenue generation. Like at what stage would you as an individual angel investor or also as a mentor, take a risk on a company?
Yeah, so for me, yeah, I'll give you two answers. One answer is that the honest to God truth about any investment, it's a gut feel. And anybody who tells you it isn't a gut feel, I'm sorry, but I don't believe you. It's always a gut feel. And all the analysis you might do afterwards to some extent is, post ipso facto justification. But if I had to say, okay, what is a specific metric I look for? I look for a very strong evidence on customer demand and on the fact that that particular startup has a handle on the customer demand, whether they have got actual interest and they're starting to engage, or in some cases they've had a track record of having totally understood how to build customer engagement, how to build a business proposition, how to deliver features that the customer is looking for. So there's those two things. So typically, if I think about the companies I invested in, the founders have either they've done something really unique to unlock the customer side, and that in my view, that's going to scale and that's going to run, and they're going to have a pathway to grow and be sustainable. Or there are people who've just done this before. They've got a track record, and the business that they're doing now is something that interests me. So it's very much a heart and mind dynamic. And early stage is also to some extent easier in that sense. If you're going to go into Series A or Series B, talking about much larger amounts of money that I couldn't afford. And also sometimes you have a lot of other stakeholders who do want that kind of analysis. But, frankly, I'm a high conviction investor. I generally invest in a founder or a founding team that have those two things. I get them from a values point of view, and I really believe that they've got something unique in the way that they're going to approach customers.
Have you done any follow-up investments, for example, in later rounds or whatnot?
I have helped people do due diligence on some of those follow-up rounds. I've given opinions, I've given introductions, I've helped to put together different investors. And that's probably another aspect that we're seeing, certainly in the Australian VC system, where we've started to see VCs collaborate much more closely. We've also seen that typically the people who invest in space startups are not finance people. They're not people who are looking for a fast return or a quick return within 5 or 7 years. They're typically people who have come from operational roles. They even in some cases have experience with space companies, or certainly a deep tech as a concept. And they're folks who are collaborating to drive the outcome. So I think that's something that's quite unique about space. You see the same factors in biotech, interestingly, which is another deep tech area, which is quite simple. That's quite similar. And so I think, so I haven't personally participated in rounds, yet. I have taken, multiple early stage. So sometimes, people have done a pre-seed and a seed. So I've done that because I'm doubling down. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that day. Hopefully, one of my investments pays off. Partly for me, my motivation is not to get rich quick. My motivation is actually I want to be part of what I see as making history. And if I can unlock that founder, if I can give them that strong signal, keep going, and here's a way that I can show that, not just by patting on the shoulder, but here's a check, that can have a massive impact on people's momentum. And that's the name of the game in any startup.
Wow, that's fantastic. So the startup is also getting a lot of value out of you and a lot of passion out of you. It sounds like not only your expertise in aeronautical engineering and leadership in deep tech, long history there, but also just your passion for space and your network.
I try, look, and one of the key things that I also try to be, as somebody who has all that experience, I try not to be a knower. I try to use that experience to frame good questions. And also, I'm keen to learn from everyone. I'm keen to learn from you guys. So when I'm working with that founder, I'm definitely not saying, this is what you should do. That's really robbing them of their agency. The way I try to approach it is to sort of say, what about this? What about that? And I try to use my knowledge to ask smart questions, or hopefully smart questions. And that process of learning, or that process of me asking those questions, people seem to find that helpful. Certainly, if I feel strongly about something, I will say, look, I think, or it's my opinion that, and then almost always as a coach, and I do sometimes teach other coaches, I coach them to do this, which is, this is my opinion, blah. Ultimately, it's your decision. right? And when you've got to be like that with a founder, in my view, especially, you know, someone who's supposedly put on a pedestal of having lots of experience, as you have. Thank you. I'm very, very touched, you know, but ultimately it's an experiment, and we're all running the experiment together. And if I give an opinion and the founder thinks the exact opposite, then in a funny way, that's a win, because regardless, you know, they're going to run an experiment, they're going to learn something, and then and my ego shouldn't be a factor, you know. It should be about them learning faster, and that's what, you know, that's what I try to honestly take that approach. Yeah.
Awesome. So you're also currently an advisor for an Australian startup called High Earth Orbit Robotics, which plans to perform in-orbit satellite inspection services. Can you quickly summarize their product and tell us like a concrete story of how they convinced you to be an angel investor?
Sure. Well, look, I will correct that statement slightly, which is they're not planning to. They are taking in-orbit inspection photographs right now, and they can you can hire them for that purpose, and they can generally deliver a photograph within, you know, a few days. So it's a pretty incredible business. I was very lucky at meeting the founding team, Will and Hiranya, quite early on in their journey. They were originally, and still to this day are, passionate asteroid explorers. They want to, specifically, they want to image and understand near Earth orbit crossing asteroids. You know, there's actually quite a lot of asteroids that cross the Earth's orbit around the sun, and so that you don't have to go out millions and millions and billions of miles to the Oort cloud, etc., to find asteroids. Quite often they're just coming through the cislunar region, and so they're not that far away. So they had this vision of intercepting them, taking photographs of them, and they felt like their understanding of orbital mechanics, their kind of deep, you know, skill in creating camera systems, those two things together could put them in a position where they could maybe become a prospector for the kind of minerals that might exist in these asteroids. However, closing that business case is pretty tough, and customers, you know, are thin on the ground. You know, even governments and mining companies, you know, as excited as they might be about the future of asteroid mining, not necessarily going to give you any money today. So, but what was very smart about the team was they recognized that there were, you know, they sort of realized that very few people were actually taking photographs in space of other space objects. And then they had the idea, well, maybe we could image other satellites, you know, and maybe we could do that from space. And then what is really truly brilliant is that team is also very good at relationships, and making relationships and building relationships and partnerships. That's one of their superpowers, which I recommend all deep tech, all space startups should actually develop. And what they were able to do is they recognized that actually most of the cameras that are being used for Earth observation right now are heavily underutilized. There's a huge amount of spare capacity. In particular, the spare capacity, you know, at certain times of the day and over certain parts of the Earth. And so they worked out that maybe they could borrow people's existing in-space cameras. And sure enough, they had the chutzpah to ask, and people said, yeah, okay. And then they additionally then went on to ask, can we reprogram your cameras for this specific conjunction that we're going to try and photograph? And then people would be, well, you're a really nice guy. Sure, okay, as long as you put it back. And so now, fast forward to today, they have access to literally dozens and dozens and dozens of spacecraft, and they can task them using their software at a time when the people who run those spacecraft don't need those cameras, aren't using them. And so they've been able to create an entire business without having to launch a single spacecraft or put a single piece of hardware in space. However, that is now their next stage. Their next stage is to put a huge amount of cameras in space. And so they've developed a very, very advanced camera. And what they're doing is they're actually getting those cameras into other people's hands who are looking for a great camera and don't actually want to spend, you know, millions of bucks on that camera. And they're going to be buying these cameras, you know, or even getting these cameras potentially for just a token amount, and getting to fly their mission with high Earth orbit robotics cameras in return for high Earth orbit robotics being able to task those cameras to do their in-orbit imaging business, right? What a cool business. So, you know, that for me, the moment when I was very lucky that I met them very early on, and they were going through an accelerator program that I helped to design. And, I was, wow, I love you guys. Your values are amazing, but I just don't get this asteroid business. The minute that they cracked this approach of borrowing other people's cameras, and then the minute that they started to take the first photographs with other people's cameras, I was in. That was it. I was like, I'm done.
Crowdsourced in orbit inspections, right? It's very clever.
So, Tim, you were mentioning about, while investing, heart and mind and gut feel is pretty important. But do you have any checklist of requirements before you will consider investing in a new space startup? And what evaluation criteria do you use during your pitch?
So I guess, yeah, that's a really interesting question. You're asking me to rummage around in my subconscious to some extent. If I had to look at the things that attracted me, it would be, I kind of get the tech. So that would be a tick. I'm intrigued by the tech. I get the tech. I also like, I'm somebody who's done a fair bit of systems engineering, or I've been blessed enough to work with very, very talented software architects and system architects, both working for me as well as working alongside me. And so I like to see how the puzzle pieces will come together within a supply chain or with an ecosystem, and give myself a sense of where this company is going to go. And, there is a rule of thumb. You sort of say to yourself, okay, well, will they be acquired, or will they become, unicorn in their own right? The reality for most deep tech businesses, most space startup companies, is that at some point they'll probably get acquired. That's probably, they'll either be acquired by a bigger company, or they'll join some kind of roll up, which is something that we're just starting to see in the space industry in this era that may continue on of SPACs. And I come to that because, having worked in the media and internet business for a long time, those were things we saw then as internet companies matured. The internet businesses would start to acquire other companies, or they would merge with other companies. Some of them went public, and then the best ones would learn how to acquire companies and integrate them from a cultural point of view. So I see space is on that same trajectory. So having a view of, how do I think this exit will play out? Not, oh, I'm looking forward to them having this kind of exit, but just, can I see them being able to get there? And one of the aspects of that is that the narrative hangs together. And so the pitch, a perfect pitch, should pass what in Australia we call the pub test, right? And that means you can step away from the pitch, having heard it. You can go to a pub, you can have a drink with a mate, and then turn around and say, I'm going to tell you about this company, and nail all the key points, right? So that pub test thing sometimes means you miss out on detail that, might be important to that business. But then when the person starts asking you questions, you remember some of that detail. So that pub test is also an aspect of this. And I've certainly, sweated over pitches and fluffed pitches and screwed up pitches for things that I came up with that didn't pass that test. And then I've been very lucky that I've been a pitch coach for probably, hundreds of companies in every single possible industry you can imagine. And almost always, I get a sense of, do I understand the problem? Is the problem significant, painful, and will people pay for it? Are you doing something quite unique, quite original, that will attract people's attention, that will get them to transact with you? And what is the evidence that you've got? What is the evidence of traction that you can give me that there is a potential market? And do you have a handle on the first step? In classic parlance, it's almost like the TAM, SAM, SOM stuff, where when you're talking to a startup, you want them to have a handle on total addressable market. Yeah, great. There's blue sky. Simple addressable market. Okay, there's something that you can go after. And then simple obtainable market. The first phone call you made yesterday, or you're going to make today or tomorrow to get those first customers in. And those things are very fundamental. What I don't do is necessarily go, okay, when are you going to make revenue? I don't necessarily do that to space companies. I do that to software companies, to SaaS businesses, yes. To people who, can go on to Facebook and stick up an ad and start to test customer responses, fine. But often with space companies, actually, it's a slightly different TAM, SAM, SOM discussion. It's more about, who can you partner with? Who do you think could include you in their research project or in their prototype? because actually it takes a village to build up a space company. It takes lots of different companies collaborating together to make something that, a government or a prime is actually going to, take a punt on. So hopefully that's given you a sense of it. It's a bit of a random walk through the characteristics that hopefully, anyway, I answered your question, Balaj.
I do have a question for the concept that it takes a village to build a space company. Do you think that is starting to change with, for example, one of our previous podcast episodes was with Shankar of Antares Space. And, I think he's trying to sort of solve that problem, right? He's creating, one of the things he's doing is creating a marketplace where, you can easily, for example, find someone to assemble your satellite. Let's say you have a company which, you want to put a sensor, a remote sensing sensor into space and do some Earth observation. Well, a platform like this might be able to, make it very easy for me to just sit in my garage and, order the construction of this CubeSat with these specs, and and I can quickly figure out how to get that signal back to the Earth, from my ground station. And by signing up even with multiple vendors, depending on the location in the orbit, and maybe control it through the cloud. Do you think that there's a trend towards making it possible to maybe sit in my garage and make a space product?
That is the essence, I think, of where we are heading. So you can think about it in terms of verticals and horizontals, right? So if you want to make something really fast and really big, and you've got plenty of capital, then your SpaceX/Rocket Lab model, where you've got a very high vertical integration, and it's actually quite difficult to break into that specific supply chain because they're going as fast as they can. They've got lots of resources. They can invest hard ahead of things. So that's certainly one model, and it's a spike vertical model. And we've seen how amazing that's been. But it's not necessarily sustainable, because what can happen in those highly vertically integrated supply chains is ultimately you either disrupt yourself and become more horizontal, or you sort of get stale, right? And so, if you've got an Elon Musk, if you've got someone who's got that vision and got that drive and really, really has managed to get that big fat customer, the US government, who had a huge problem, which was, we didn't have any, human space flight capability in America anymore. We didn't have our engines even anymore. So you've got that situation where you had somebody spike that out, and that's your SpaceX. And to some extent, that's your Rocket Lab. However, it's not sustainable. And so what you described of a horizontal platforming is, I believe, where we're now in the stage of building. And that's about interoperability. That is about leveraging what we've learned through the birth of the PC and then the internet, the commodification of compute and memory, so that we have now cloud computing. And I see a lot of people are talking about this idea. We don't know how quickly it's going to happen, but certainly, Shankar, who's someone I have massive respect for, and I believe in his thesis that we're going to commodify satellites. We're going to end up with quite general purpose satellites as a foundation. Yeah, we'll have some special purpose ones. We'll continue to need to do that for a long time, but we're going to end up with, effectively the Starlinks are a commodified, satellite. They've mass produced them. So the per satellite cost is probably 100x lower than if you went and ordered a few of those from, say, Raytheon, right? Or Airbus. So that means that when you start commodifying these things, you can start abstracting them. And bam, what you just described right there, where suddenly you've got this Swiss Army knife of capabilities. So how that's going to play out, the messiness of it, I think, is going to be fascinating to watch. And I think the same way that we saw, the messiness of mobile phone vendors, the messiness of PC vendors, the messiness of there's a whole world that we don't necessarily see as consumers of subcomponent suppliers, Samsung, Apple, duking it out over the chip sets that they're getting from Taiwan or wherever, right? So I think all of that is going to be playing out over the next few years. Certainly software redefinable spacecraft is something that the big players like, Airbus, Arianespace, and others they're talking about that now. When they're selling a geostationary spacecraft to someone like Optus Australia, one of Australia's largest operators of commercial communication satellites? Australia, yeah, it is. Singtel Optus, in fact, which straddles ASEAN. They are now about to, acquire software redefinable spacecraft, which is to say, not that you can reprogram them. Of course, you've always been able to reprogram them, but that they can reprogram the antenna. They can point the beams differently. They can do different things. And taking that to the next level, they're now starting to do in-orbit servicing. So, US company Space Logistics is about to use its MEV vehicle in, I think it's 2024, 2023, to service an Optus spacecraft and extend its life. So you have this, idea of, the software that's running inside the spacecraft, the software you're using to manage these space assets, but also you have suddenly this idea of the in-space economy, how we're going to be servicing, how we're going to be moving around things. And so there's a whole new realm, which is about, people servicing each other to maintain or extend the life of, or even, leverage existing in-space assets to build completely new ones, replicating and self-replicating and so forth. So it's a very interesting kind of picture from a hardware point of view, from a software point of view, from a computer science point of view, from every way you look at it, it's kind of, bicycles for the mind, to rip off Steve Jobs. It really is.
Oh, nice. That was pretty interesting. So you were mentioning about due diligence.
Yeah.
So every industry or investor has a different due diligence process. So what is the general due diligence process for funding like, especially for a new space company, when you compare with a tech startup?
So I think I think for me, you've got to balance the technology piece. I look at it as deep tech investing. Essentially, you've got to have a sense that the company has a strong understanding of the technology or of the technical challenges, and equally, you can't be carried away so much by their understanding of technology that you forget that they also need to have a solid business nous. Right. So certainly I've been involved in a due diligence where the company had a fantastic technical vision. The founders themselves didn't necessarily have like a university level understanding of the operating technology that they were using, but they were people who understood how public markets worked. They had a track record of starting companies and then successfully exiting them in a positive way. And they were just very excited about the space realm. And so, while the technical due diligence on one hand, you'd be like, wow, they're not, necessarily technically super savvy. The business side sort of, you kind of get this sense of they're going to work it out, and they're going to hire people who are as good as, they're going to hire people who will help them work it out. And so that's a very tricky line, but that's certainly something where I've found, okay, here's a company that is very much about the technology. They have some relationships with the customers, but really they're a tech play. I find those a lot harder to invest in. And here's a company that's all business. It has no clue about the technology, but it's got these big, exciting visions. I find them harder to invest in. I want there to be a balance of the two. And if you had to sort of say, give me the short version, Tim, I would say I'm going to use the word product. I want to have a sense that there is this balance between the needs of the customers and how they're going to, and what features they're going to prioritize. And that's product. That's the dynamic of sort of saying our roadmap is one that's product focused. We're going to be ensuring that the next feature we build is something that we can test immediately with a customer or a partner. And so it's a very almost terrestrial pedestrian idea. And I tell you that because I want you to feel that, if your audience is interested in investing in a space company, don't think that it's pie in the sky. Don't think that it's all rocket science. Actually, your gut feel around product, those things do apply. The things that are a little unusual is government's a big customer, military is a big customer. Those are things that are a little bit unusual. And so you've got to think through, it's a very B2B/B2G type space. and there's a lot less B2C, right? That's the one thing to wrap your head around. But honestly, I found that the principles do apply. In some ways, coming out of the space sector and knowing a lot about the space industry is almost a disadvantage for me, because in some cases I find myself going, I'm not sure if I'd invest in that. And people who have less knowledgeable about space, but have more experience than me in doing transactions, are like, no, I would definitely go for that company, and here's why. And that's always, that's one of the reasons I enjoy, the process of doing due diligence and working with startups. Is sometimes you're like, oh wow, okay, I hadn't thought about it that way. Another thing to watch out for is in Australia sometimes, and this is something that I definitely know is true in other countries, sometimes we sort of limit our thinking to what we can see around us in our own country or in our own region. I've just come back from Colorado, where I had the rare pleasure of A, leaving the country, but B, going to one of the world's largest space conferences, and had a chance to kind of get a sense of the scale of the market in North America, at least, and also, assess Australian companies' ability to get into that market, which is incredibly high. Actually, we are accepted into that world very, very easily. So that's one of Australia's unfair advantages, I think, and which we haven't been using until lately. But really, the thing that I've come away from is I got to recalibrate some of my sense of scale and some of my sense of what's possible, and then think about some of the startups we're working with that they can go to a market like that, or they can go to markets like Europe or Japan or other markets and get into them at a pretty high level, if they have that business nous, and if they have also something original on the technology side. So that's kind of some thoughts. I hope they answered your question, Balaji.
Yeah, actually, you answered. I mean, even you answered actually one of my questions too, especially about the product and also the team. But in terms of the team, I have a question. In your experience here, what do you think are the key qualities a founding team should have? For example, an industry veteran or a PhD expert, or who is more into the finance, who has a leadership.
Yeah, look, I think you have to be cognizant of your gaps. So that's probably one of the most powerful things. I had an engineering and science education, and that gives me a massive blind spot, which is I think I have to have the answer to everything, because so I had too many bloody exams. Too many of the kind of questions that I was asked were, okay, what's the answer to that question? So I often find myself thinking that I have to have all the answers. And I've done a startup and failed where I thought that I had to know what I was. So I think one of the most powerful things about a founding team is yes, you want to have an absolutely powerful vision, but you also want to have this hunger to understand the gaps. You have to be looking around and thinking, okay, what are my personal gaps, and how do I compensate for those with either a founder or as a team? If we have these gaps, what advisors do we need? What partners do we need? What kind of questions should we be working on to meet those gaps? There are companies, like Relativity Space, for example, who raised $1 billion and hadn't flown a spacecraft yet, hadn't built a plant yet, and they're able to raise $1 billion. How would they do that? Because they had a huge amount of orders already from customers who were desperate to get into space. And so they had that incredible strength on that sales side, but then they also had to execute. Once they had that cash, they had to turn around and execute for their vision of 3D printing rockets. And so that always blows my mind, that there are people who have the depth of knowledge or depth of insight, rather, not knowledge, the depth of insight, to my mind, to achieve that pivot from, okay, we're going to come out to the market and say, we're going to build 3D printed rockets and we're going to be flying them every week, and then pre-sell those, and then raise the money and then deploy those funds. I mean, how could anybody do that? The only way you could do that is by kind of being the dumbest person in the room, right? And making sure that you surrounded yourself with much smarter people. And then so what does the founding team need to have? Values. You need to have great values. You need to have that. If you're going to be if you're going to be somebody who is part of what we described before, which is this emerging supply chain, you've got to be able to play well with others, and you got to have a singular vision, of course. If you can, this is the mountain that we're shooting for. I'm not going to be totally a control freak about how we're going to get from where we are here to that mountain. I'm going to need everyone to help me to figure out along the way where to go. And sometimes we're going to hit a roadblock and we're going to have to pivot, change direction, whatever. And so, I know that if you think of the story of SpaceX, even, their story certainly had a few near-death experiences. What Jeff Bezos is doing with Blue Origin, it's very interesting because they've decided to go in a completely different direction and try to crack suborbital first, and a human-rated suborbital. Very, very different direction from saying, let's just go orbital from day one. But they have a strong opinion about that and how they're then going to scale out of that. So I think there's no one right answer. But, the reason that I would want to work with a founding team is, the same three reasons often that you might use to hire someone as well, right? So, if you're going to go through an interview, you're usually looking for three things. Number one, do you think they can do the job? Whether it's they've got the skill or they're going to go get that skill. Do you think they can do it? Secondly, do you think they're going to thrive? Do you think they're going to enjoy on that journey? Does it look like they're really struggling and I'm going to suffer? I've got this vision, but it's going to be, is it actually going to be hard for them? It's not going to be good for them. They're not going to enjoy that job. And the third thing is, are they going to piss you off? Right? Do you want to hang out with them? Are they people that you want to hang out with? Or are they going to annoy you? That's actually, those are the three reasons you might hire someone. They got to tick off all three. They can do the job. They're going to enjoy doing the job, and they're not going to annoy you. That it's the same as an investor. That you want to have those three things, because if you are a high conviction investor, there are low conviction investors who just want market exposure to transact. But if you're a high conviction investor, which is typically what deep tech investors are, then you want to go on that journey with them. You want to hang out with them. You want to, you're going to be spending a significant part of your life and your dreams and aspirations helping them. So, yeah.
Got it. That makes sense. So new space products can be divided into categories. There's different kinds of categories, but for example, manufacturing, launch, communications, Earth observation, navigation, and then there's other emerging segments, some that you mentioned, such as in-space manufacturing, asteroid mining, moon mining, etc. So alternatively, you might be able to think in terms of products related to human habitability in LEO, or the moon, or Mars. So what segments do you see as being the most attractive or having the most growth potential?
So personally, my opinion I'm still very excited about exploration. I'm still very excited about humanity venturing out into the solar system. I'm very much interested in also for a number of reasons. First of all, I'd love to be one of those people if I can. I'll probably be a diversity hire, I'm sure. Old person who's only got one fully functioning eye, tick, right? So, but I'd like to experience that in my lifetime, and I feel like that we're coming up in the next few years, we're going to have this very exciting moment. The core human milestones that Artemis have set for themselves is to put 4 teams down on the moon, one after the other, each team spending up to 30 days. So if you think about that, and then you think about the requirements for human beings to live in that extreme environment for 30 days on the moon, and then come away from that safely, it's an order of magnitude tougher than Apollo. Also, part of that program is the Artemis Gateway, which is a space station orbiting the moon. So we're going to have people living on this space station, which is like a week away. Another big area that I'm thinking about, as I said, is I'm thinking about using data from space to solve big problems, right? Which is, so things like finding sources of methane, finding whether the mitigation efforts that we're doing around carbon dioxide sequestration or reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide from all sorts of different industries, whether they're actually working, and then using that to power smarter investments, right? Using that to power better, trading mechanisms for changing and driving change through sustainability. So there's a very, summarizing, there's a very poetic drive that I have around space exploration, and there's a very prosaic drive towards, using a very technocratic, data-driven approach to solve huge problems that we're experiencing with climate change, with hitting the planetary boundaries as we are in our economy, with water, with arable land, with food sources, with waste, with microplastics, all those kinds of things. That's the gamut for me, and there's hardware and software right through that.
Pretty much exciting times. Actually, you were talking about Artemis, so had a similar question about Artemis too. So Artemis 1 is expected to launch around June 2022. How do you think the new space industry is going to change after the Artemis mission?
Wow, what a great question. Look, I think that it will become hopefully clearer to everybody that there is more than just SpaceX, right? In the general population. I'm hoping that Artemis will also open people's eyes up to the things that Axiom is planning to do, the things that the Orbital Reef consortium are planning to do, that other people are doing in orbit, and that are going to open, in particular, kids' eyes up to the things that we can do in space as a species. There's this. So I think personally, we're going to get more interesting people engaged with new space, and I also think you're going to start to see people from other industry sectors who have amazing skills and amazing things to offer coming into new space and building new economic engines that are perhaps not as reliant on government funding. We have to roll the red carpet out to these different sectors of the economy who are super excited about the possibility of space and help them uncover new business models. And I think that's going to be an aspect of new space. If you think about how the internet started off as something that just people in universities used. I first encountered the internet. I first had an email address because I was a researcher in a university, right? And then now, you can go into a tech shop next to a market in downtown Jogjakarta and pick up a quad-core Snapdragon Android phone that will allow you to access most of the world's knowledge as a teenager in Indonesia, right? So we've got that extraordinary human potential from all these different areas. I want to see that go into new space. I think also we're going to see, as I said, Artemis is going to hopefully ignite a fire about science and about facts and about running experiments and about also sort of hopefully uncover more about technology to the general public. And I also hope that same thing I described before, that the average person is going to, perhaps through telepresence, right, is going to be down, with a virtual reality headset in real time or near real time, speed of light, of course, but near real time, riding shotgun with some of these astronauts and or these autonomous rovers. And then it's going to want to look back at the Earth, right? And it's going to have that same moment. Wow, I can lift my robotic claw up and block the Earth, block everybody that I've ever loved, everybody that I've ever known, the entirety of human history. I just blocked it with a claw, right? The same way that the Bowman in Apollo 8 was able to do that with his thumb as the Apollo 8 command module went around from the dark side of the moon. It's that sort of. So I think Artemis is going to have a profound impact on the general population and therefore on new space.
Awesome, fascinating. So what do you think are the key and immediate challenges in the new space industry? For example, lack of funding, lack of resources or government regulations? What blockers do you see?
So I think bringing that village together is probably the toughest thing, right? So there's certainly there are strong forces at play in a lot of governments around the world that need to procure systems which make them go, we need a prime. And there is a lot of pressures on those primes to bring in existing systems that they've developed over a long time frame. So I think one of the dynamics we've got is this challenge of this idea that companies with big balance sheets who have very, very capable technologies, who've done it all before, get picked, and they create kind of vertically integrated stovepipe systems that governments can have a tick. Okay, we've got one of those now. Versus a model whereby you've got a much more, an ecology of lots of different companies, lots of different technologies, and lots of experiments being run on how to build that same capability for a fraction of the cost, but with perhaps more complexity, right? So one of the biggest challenges in my American friends tell me, look, in America, we are developing a lot of technologies, a lot of new technologies, but we're not necessarily getting the maximum benefit out of them because we have to then integrate them with giant stovepipe systems that we've had for decades. And those giant stovepipe systems are chewing up a lot of cash that we would rather be, but we can't do anything about it. You guys in Australia, you don't have any of those stovepipe systems. You're going to get the maximum benefit from the new innovative stuff that's coming out of your startups community. So for God's sake, make sure you buy some of that new stuff and don't just, buy, the stuff that our primes are necessarily offering you. Now, that's painting our primes in a pretty negative light. I think they get it. They get that they have to go through this transformation. In the digital world, we were familiar with where IBM was back in the day. Those of us who are old enough to remember that anyway, maybe you guys weren't. And back then, IBM looked at a company like Microsoft and poo-pooed it, right? And, we are IBM. We make big supercomputers and mainframes. That's, of course, going to be the serious game in town. And all these little punk, PCs, they're not serious. The Apple II, the Acorn, BBC Micro, it's for kids. What happened, however, is a bottom-up revolution. Ultimately, those mainframes and those mini computers were not agile enough to deal with the problems that were emerging. So the techies would smuggle the home PCs in to the office, and there was a bottom-up revolution, and eventually they ate the entire business out from underneath the big guys, and IBM got out of computers. Wang, DEC, all those people don't make, supercomputers anymore because no one wants them. They make, and now we have this whole full circle where there are people who just specialize on blade servers, and virtualization. So we had this. So I think you're going to see, my personal belief, my opinion is that we're going to see something similar in space, where we're going to see a lot of the very big vertically integrated classic, defense systems and, massive satellite, where there's a whole bunch of, gnomes sitting under the ground in white coats, tinkering away to build a giant bus-sized, so I think that's going to go away. And I think what you're going to see is increasingly all of this ecology of small companies, but the small companies, and Shankar would have told you this, they need interoperability. They need some new set of standards. They need software standards, hardware interface standards. They need the ability to build a satellite which is not, 1/3 connectors, and is actually efficient in terms of packaging. So I think we're going to see, my personal take is we're going to see the biggest challenge we face right now is how to get to that interoperability point. How do we not have folks stuck in, well, I've figured out a particular customer niche, I've got vendor lock-in with them, I'm just going to do my thing, right? And then I'll be part of this, group, and then we'll just hold on to that as long as we can. I think that's a challenge, and I think that diminishes the amount of places for capital to come in and run experiments. I don't necessarily believe in 2022 that there's not enough capital now. I think that was definitely true 5 years ago. I think now we've almost got too much capital, which one should never hear oneself say that, but it's almost like we want companies to be tested in the marketplace. We want companies to be invested in smart ways. Some of the things that we're seeing companies, for example, like Spire, who does incredible work. They're building spacecraft that are assessing frequencies, radio frequencies all over the globe in an incredible way. And yet they're valued at cents in the dollar, in the public market. We have completely new companies who come up with a PowerPoint deck saying they're going to do same thing. And they end up with a higher valuation. We've got some weird stuff going on, right?
That actually, if I can interrupt you, that actually leads me to the next question, which is, so you have this rich experience with, with tech companies, including, I imagine you experienced the .com bubble of the 90s. Right. So with that perspective that you have, are we in a new space bubble right now?
I think the answer is probably yes, although it's one where there is a thing that's going to sustain this bubble in a way, which is that governments are recognizing that their societies are incredibly dependent on space technology, and they've woken up to that, right? So the bubble, many people would argue that the .com bubble, we all ran ahead of broadband internet speed. We were creating businesses before the consumers really had a smart way to access what we were building. We didn't have CDNs. We didn't have, average internet speed for even the high income world was 56, kilobits per second, for God's sake, right? And so I think we ran ahead. I think that to some extent, I do believe that we're in a bit of a bubble, but I predict a softer landing because, as I said, I think people are working up to the fact that space is critical infrastructure. I do think we're in a bubble, but I don't know if it's going to be a crash. I think that to some extent we're going to see more maybe mergers and acquisitions. We're going to see companies that may stumble or have financial difficulty, but then they'll be acquired because they've got capabilities that people need. And then we're going to have a continual flow of new businesses flowing in. It's a bit of a golden age in that sense. Yeah, I would say that, of course, being a space person, of course, I'm going to say it's going to be a soft landing. So really, nobody knows anything.
Right? I believe it. I think
really.
We're just getting started, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
And look, thinking about the internet, there was that crash, and then there was a couple of years of where the companies that had more resilience just kept going. And then we woke up 2005, bam, it was on, and companies like Amazon never stopped. Companies like Google were going from strength to strength. Microsoft were reinventing themselves. We were about to have the iPhone dropped on us. Oh my God, and meanwhile we had, NTT Docomo and all that kind of stuff early on. We had Nokia Symbian. We had all these experiments running in mobile phone land. Around that time, I was running a thing called Mobile Monday Sydney back then, part of a global network. And so we'd sort of started, the web, computers, so boring. Let's go into mobiles. So we've got this very interesting set of patterns from that tech world, and I believe those things are playing out now in space.
That's true. Actually, as we are talking about the investments and funding, I have a question about that. Which geographies or countries would you choose for a new space startup? And what are the key main reasons to choose those geographies for investments, such as regulation, tax, or even proximity to human resource? And adding to that, actually have a additional one. If it is within US or Asia Pacific, which particular location?
Tricky. There's a few answers to this question. Some people think that it's important to be in a second tier city like a Pittsburgh or Seattle, not necessarily in the LA, San Fran, kind of hubs. That there's also a proximity to universities and university researchers and universities that are doing really interesting stuff, because there's a lot of big exciting space programs that are still run from that research world. I think proximity to talent is absolutely critical, and that's one reason why I'm a fan of Australian space companies, because we have loads of talent. I think that another aspect is, the perspective I have, of course, is a Western world oriented perspective. Japan, or the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, US, and or AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, and or all of the different players like European Space Agency, JAXA. So very much that world. That's the world that I can really comment on. I think that where there are really strong university clusters, because it's deep tech, right? And then where there are also people who are smart about investing, and in an ideal world, a place where you have bigger companies that are also smart at sleuthing out those startups and partnering with them. So, Canberra is a great example. Canberra ecosystem in Australia, great universities. Those universities have ended up spinning out companies that have been able to access funding from the local Canberra government. And then equally, they can hop, skip, and a jump down to Sydney or Melbourne and have huge talent pools right there. And they can get on a plane and go over to the US or to Europe, to India or Japan, and make strategic partnerships. So I think Singapore is an excellent crossing place. It's another place that people say could be a really powerful space player. I'm a bit of a fan of Penang. I think Penang has a lot of very deep technologies in Malaysia. That sort of Penang/Klang Valley KL axis is one that a lot of people discount or underestimate. There's a lot of very advanced technology people there. South Korea, very exciting technologies and companies there. They're in the process of I believe unbundling their space agency to some extent to make the conditions right for startups. Philippines, again, another place with great tech, great talent, and also great English. So they're able to access the US in a very straightforward way. As you run around the region, people have great opinions around people in Vietnam. They've been trained very well by Japan. So there are apparently some great spacecraft operators there. So honestly, I expect and I hope over the next decade that we're going to start to see a lot of collaboration between these different places.
Thank you. So we have a final question. So do you have any advice for aspiring new space entrepreneurs for our audience?
So my advice is ask questions, turn up, and make the assumption that you have something to offer. Don't feel intimidated by it. That's probably the number one thing. It is about relationships. Yes, there's lots of technology, and it's good to do courses and understand that technology to the extent that you can. If you're really into it, fantastic. Go down the rabbit hole, do that degree, get involved, but get involved in student societies as well. If you're a student or if you're a general public person, go along to lectures, volunteer, offer support, offer whatever you can to get involved. And there's lots of different things like the NASA Space Apps Challenge and all sorts of other things where members of the general public can actually, come in and try on solving problems in the space domain. And it's remarkable how many folks who have done that have ended up becoming leaders in the space sector. I can think of a number who I'd love to get involved in the space industry. I decided to go along to Space Apps Challenge because I was quite a good programmer. Fast forward 5 years, they're leading, space companies' technology development efforts, and that's a true story, and that's the story that I keep hearing. So I think it is that golden time. It is that golden opportunity to not just feel like I'm not the right stuff, so I'll never be picked. No, I think that's not true. The right stuff is much more about your heart and your aspiration, and of course you've got to be prepared to be entrepreneurial about it. So there is that whole startup journey you got to go on, and it can be a roller coaster emotionally. But lean in, see if you can find a place. That's what I try to do every day as it's changing and as it's evolving. And I think that, as I said, a lot of people talk about the democratization of space. Actually living that is tough, especially people who've been working in the space for a long time. They feel like, oh, wow, I've done my time, I should have some extra benefits. But at the same time, I think we are just beginning, as you guys have said, and it's a great time. And I invite your listeners to lean in, see what role you can play, whichever country you're in. I bet there are opportunities. I bet there are possibilities, and I look forward to meeting you sometime, somewhere, some planet soon.
Thanks for joining us, Tim. Your insights into new space startups and investment were very informative for us and our audience. We look forward to seeing you in Tokyo.
Thank you for having me, guys. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Entrepreneurial Space Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Anderson, here with co-host Balaji Santanam. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.